All right, good afternoon, or should I say good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to the ICS seminar. I am Pavlos Protobabas, and I'm the scientific director for the Institute. For people that don't know, ICS seminars are bi-weekly and are on topics in data science and computational science, and we get speakers from academia and industry. We have two more seminars coming up, October 23rd by Genghis on a functional approximation perspective on sensor representations, and then Jesh Stoth from Fidelity Investment. It is my pleasure today to introduce the speaker, Aaron Hertzman, who is a principal scientist at Adobe. Aaron received his bachelor in computer science and art history from Rice University. Then he did a PhD in computer science at NYU. And then for 10 years, he was a professor at University of Toronto. And while I was doing that, he will also work at Pixar Animation, University of Washington, Micro Research, Mitsubishi Electric Research Lab, and Interval Research Corporation. So today he's going to be talking if computers could make art. And let's welcome Aaron.
Great, thank you. I'm hitting share screen now. So you should be seeing my slides momentarily. Let me know if you don't in a few minutes or in a minute or two. Thanks again for inviting me. I obviously wish I could be there in person. So just a little bit about myself. As Pavlos mentioned, my undergraduate degree was in art and computer science. So I'm interested both in art and in painting and stuff like that, and also in as a computer scientist in algorithms for creating art and creating artistic images and line drawings. And so my focus is in the wrong window. Let me see if I can fix this. All right, so I'll advance slides a different way. Okay, so in the past few years, I think the idea of AI generated artwork has become really popular and come into the public view, especially with the Deep Dreams method in 2015, which had a brief moment of fame, and neural stylization methods became really popular for a while, and filters like Prisma and the Facebook video filters. And now there's like an explosion of interest of things like neural network generated movie scripts and neural generated band names and like all these fun applications, neural generated knitting. And now definitely let me know if you're not seeing my slides. So this started becoming visible.
For a second?
Yes?
The resolution of your slides are not the same quality as when we tested it. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's the network.
Yeah, stop sharing, share again.
Let's try again. Just, they don't come through, something with the network. It's just me or everybody sees the same? Hans-Peter, you said it's the same, right?
Yeah, I think it's heavy Zoom compression. I think it might be a network issue. Like your whole desktop is right now. It's very grainy and low res. So I think that
if I turn off screen share for video compression, is it any different now?
Much better, yes.
Okay, so maybe the videos won't come through as well, but that's fine. Okay, so hopefully, yeah, let me know if there's any other issues, but you should be seeing my slides again. So these kinds of tools have gained the attention of the contemporary art world in various ways. So this is the first show that I saw in this space in 2016. And there are a bunch of fairly big name artists like Trevor Paglen and Jason Salvon who've been exploring AI-based tools for making art. And it's also showing up in the popular culture. So this is from the TV show Silicon Valley in 2018.
I like it. It's really cool. So who painted it? A machine.
It's actually the first work of art made by AI to be sold.
That was fiction. Then about 6 months later, a work generated with a generative adversarial network was auctioned at Christie's for $500,000. And they even signed the image with the GAN loss function. And this is showing up in academic papers as well. So in one academic paper the authors have written, we propose a new system for generating art. The system generates art by looking at art and learning about style and becomes creative. So these are pretty bold statements, pretty strong statements about what the computer is doing and how it functions as an artist. And these things are getting picked up by the news. So artificially intelligent painters invent new styles of art, or going down the food chain, the AI artist that can create its own painting style, and critics even prefer some of its work to human efforts. And all this discussion is really, at least in the popular media, discussing the computer as the artist. So here's Jerry Saltz, who's one of the preeminent art critics in the world.
Initial thoughts, incredibly dull, generic, boring. The programmers are not freeing up the program. I want the robot to tap into its inner robot. Be free.
He's really accepted the idea of the computer as this conscious, intelligent, autonomous artist. But so there's a real serious question here, which is whether computers can be considered artists. And it's a question I think a lot of people are asking in different ways. And it's not even clear exactly how do you phrase the question. Some people I've talked to have sort of posed it purely as a question of technological capability. That it's just assumed that you can be an artist. It's just like, are they good enough? Like, do we have enough teraflops, or are GPUs good enough for that? I think other people have take sort of the opposite view, that of course it's not possible, because art requires intent. You have to be expressing something. And we have some intuition, I think, that art is this purely human behavior. Like it's like having a consciousness or a soul or something. And some of these beliefs, I think, are almost religious. And it'd be nice to have a more scientific or grounded way of saying these things. So one way of phrasing the question is there some time in the future that we will credit AI as the author of some piece of art rather than the person who ran or operated that software? The main points I want to make here are that AI tools, just like other pieces of technology, are tools for artists. They advance the field, they advance the state of art, and they empower artists, and they are not themselves artists. I second want to propose a hypothesis that only social agents can make art. And I mean something very specific like that, by that, which I will explain later. So right now that basically means that only humans can make art. And there are scenarios in the future where AI systems could be considered artists, but these are really unlikely, or at least these are pure science fiction. It's almost hardly worth talking about right now. And finally, in the final part of the talk, I'm going to give a little bit of a kind of a high-level overview of some things that are going on in the intersection of AI and the art world right now, and a little bit of work we've done on exploring some of the intersection. So first, I think it's worth looking at history. And one theme we've seen throughout history is that new developments in technology have transformed art and kept art vibrant. So, and this goes back centuries. For example, the development of oil paint, the way that Van Eyck developed it, made painting much more visually expressive. You can capture more tonal range than the previous fresco technology. It was also much more practical. It's something you can do in the studio and paint in one place and move the painting somewhere else. And within the Western tradition, there was this long trend over the centuries towards more and more realistic depiction, much more of creating this illusion of reality. So by the mid-19th century, artists, some subset of artists got really, really good at creating these visually dazzling, realistic depictions. And I think for us in the contemporary era, where we're saturated by photographs and cell phones and Instagram, it's hard for us to even imagine how unique an experience it must have been like to see these kinds of pictures that we couldn't see elsewhere. So as a result, the artist's identity became highly entangled between both creating beauty and creating expression, but also creating these visually dazzling and realistic images. That was sort of the identity of what an artist was. And the thing that came along that changed that was photography. So photography was first the work of hobbyists and tinkerers and people playing around with the technology. Probably the first known photograph in the early 19th century. And of course, people started just playing with this thing and Instagramming their food. This is an image by Daguerre when he was experimenting with his method. And it's probably the first recorded photograph of a person. He was just taking a picture out his window. It took about 10 minutes to take an exposure. And there's this person standing in the lower left who was probably getting his shoe shined And so that's why he was recorded. Anyone else who was walking by would not have been captured by the 10-minute exposure. Of course, people took selfies too, but photography became significant when Daguerre came up with a technique that other people could use, and he published and described this technique. And the French government, because they felt like this technique would be valuable, they bought him out, so he didn't patent it. So anyone could use his description. And this was 1838. Within a year, this was being shown around. And classical painters, such as Paul Delaroche, immediately said, painting is dead. Because here's a technology that seems to duplicate the skill of artists. Now, so what actually happened? Well, it took many decades for the impact of photography to become really felt. One domain where the impact of photography was significant was portraiture. So then, as today, we like to record pictures of ourselves and have pictures of our ancestors, our family and friends. And it's, if you're very, very wealthy, you could have a portrait painted. For more middle classes, you could have things like silhouettes recorded. So this is how people would make portraits around then. And clearly, this is like a pretty limited representation of someone. Though very quickly, portrait studios in photography emerged, and portrait painters had to learn this new technology and reconfigure their practice. And even though it took 10 minutes to have a Daguerre type exposure, you had to sit still and brace your arm and brace your neck. This became very popular, and we now have these portrait photos of people from this era, like the famous photographer Matthew Brady, captured in really fine detail that we wouldn't have otherwise. And it was still an artistic form, as we can see from the story with George Sand. So Sand was one of the preeminent novelists of the 19th century, and she wanted to have her portrait taken, and she wanted to save some money, so she went to sort of a cheap cut rate photographer, and he took this photo, and understandably she hated it. She's one of the great minds of her generation, and she wanted the picture destroyed because it's just a bad picture of her. So she went to Nadar, who's a really colorful character and a great photographer, and they spent a lot of time together. He, did all the things that photographers do, and she ended up with this portrait that much better reflects her stature, and she was much happier with it. So the portrait painters basically, got more, mostly driven out of business, and they said photography harmed painting considerably and killed portraiture. Now, on the high end, in the sort of the art worldview, there's this long discussion about whether photography could be considered art. Is photography a valid work of art, form of art? On one side, there are the tinkerers and the hobbyists who experimented with taking pictures of photography. And one of the first strategies of any new art form is to adopt the styles and the methods of the previous art form. So here, this is a photographer, Robinson, who sort of adopted the visual style of classical painting and great themes of passing away or of simple country life. And these photographs he would take were multiple exposures composed in this classical style. And over the decades, photography had its own journals and its own exhibitions because they were not accepted by the mainstream. And it took about 60 years before photographers were able to develop their art form, that these works became accepted by major institutions like major galleries and museums. And of course, there was resistance. There were more conventional minded people like the poet Charles Baudelaire, who wrote that if photography is allowed to stand in for art, it will corrupt it completely, thanks to the stupidity of the multitude. And here we are all making photographs. The painters of the time were pushed by photography to rethink what they were doing, and they resisted. So Whistler wrote that the imitator is a poor kind of creature. If the man who paints only the tree or flower or other surface he sees before him were an artist, the king of artists would be the photographer. It is for the artist to do something beyond this. And so he advocated exploring these sort of more gauzy, hazy, expressionistic images like the one on the right, stuff that he didn't think photography could do. Even further, Van Gogh, in a letter to his brother in his pivotal year of 1888, wrote that accurate drawing is not the essential thing to aim at, because the reflection of reality in a mirror would not be a picture at all, no more than a photograph. So now artists are saying, well, photographs can duplicate reality, so an artist, someone who duplicates reality, is not really an artist. Or Munch, most famous for The Scream, wrote, "I have no fear of photography as long as it cannot be used in heaven or in hell. I'm going to paint people who breathe, feel, love, and suffer." And several decades later, after photography had been accepted as an art form, in the surrealist statements, they wrote things like, "The invention of photography dealt the mortal blow to the old modes of expression. And so now it's time for artists to break themselves of the imitation of appearances." So in short, it seems like we probably would not have modern art if it were not for the invention of photography that pushed artists to rethink what it is an artist does. So to summarize the notion of the experience of photography, at first it looked like photography automated art. Many artists feared or disparaged it, but what really happened was we have this new art form of photography. It invigorated the old art forms. Portraiturists and hobbyists got replaced. And in fact, image creation became much more democratized in the sense that we all now carry cell phones and we can all experiment and express ourselves with photography. So there's this trend that would happen over and over again. When a new technology appears, it appears like it replaces the skills of artists, and in fact, creates this blossoming of new kinds of expression. Now, in the modern era that followed, the notion of what could be considered art expanded dramatically. So, for example, this is the famous quote fountain that Duchamp showed in a salon. It was rejected originally. He took a urinal, signed his name to it, and submitted it. And this is now considered like one of the most significant works of modern art. And precisely defining what it means in the modern art world is difficult. But broadly speaking, you can say that whatever an artist does can be considered art in some setting. And now, when I talk about art here, really, I'm speaking very broadly about painting, conceptual art, music, dance, and so on. Like, these are all things we consider art forms, even though I'm going to focus primarily on sort of like modern contemporary art, or sort of like the fine art world. Within this fine art world, there's this long history of conceptual art, and notably, the painter Sol LeWitt wrote instructions for how to create his paintings, and then there's a procedure that someone else can follow to have one of his paintings. So, like, if you want to buy a Sol LeWitt painting now, you have the person who has it now has to remove it from their wall, and people from the Sol LeWitt Foundation come out and they paint that painting in your wall, following his instructions. And he wrote extensively that he viewed his artwork as a list of instructions. It was not the actual instantiation of the painting itself. In the 60s, when computers started to be able to create pictures, artists immediately started to experiment with them with generative art. People would write code, or what was then writing code, which is like plugging, circuits together, or however it was that people programmed in the 60s. There was no machine language or anything back then. But immediately they started to experiment with this new medium. One of the most significant fine artists who worked with AI and computers was Harold Cohen. He is someone who had a fine art background and went through like the major, typical painting institutions. And he was originally painting by hand, following instructions that he had built for himself. And he would like meticulously draw, following his own instructions. And then he discovered Fortran in the early 70s and was like, wow, why am I doing this by hand? And he ended up spending the rest of his career developing more and more sophisticated algorithms that would generate art from his algorithms. And so this is an example of a printer, and this is when the Computer Museum was in Boston, that was automatically, was like printing out one of the works that his system had programmed. And I'll say more about his evolution later on. Computers became good for illustration in the 80s with MacPaint and Photoshop. And people keep having the questions, is this really art when people are making art with computers? There's a lot of really nice evolutionary artwork from the 80s and 90s that there was AI art at the time. People evolving virtual creatures or virtual screensavers through user feedback. So like you can vote on which images you will, and system will evolve new artworks based on people's feedback. Computer animation is a world where there's been a significant success through the result of collaboration of artists and scientists. People on the outside tend to view computer animation as like the computer just did everything. that like the sort of like there's not a lot of understanding about how these things work. And even in the early days, before these guys, the people who founded Pixar, before they founded Pixar, they would go to Disney and try to convince animators to adopt computers. And the animators were frightened of the computer because they felt it was going to take away their jobs. When in reality, computer animation is this extremely artist-intensive process where artists are controlling every aspect of the process, spending hours and hours of artist labor just to make every little detail right. And this is why when you watch any computer animated film, the list of credits just goes on and on and on, or any so-called live action film that has lots of visual effects. So my research background is in the computer graphics world, but in a subfield of that called non-photorealistic rendering. So this is this image here is from one of my first paper, where I designed algorithms that mimic some painting styles using my own experience from art, from painting. And so here's a completely procedural algorithm that follows rules that I built for creating paintings. And it's something that you could walk up to, and the system automatically regenerates the painting over time. And this is completely procedural code, so I can tell you exactly how the algorithm works and how it's making decisions, even though none of these paintings are ones that I would know how to make myself, or that I can't predict exactly what it's going to produce. Because it's difficult to design these algorithms, I also explored doing these things by example. So this is one essentially learning algorithm I developed in 2001 that takes photographs and paintings as inputs, or in this case, a pastel drawing, and then transfers the style of that painting or this pastel drawing to a photograph. And this method is it's very much a texture method, like a lot of methods in this space, but it still captures a lot of the style of the example. But again, even though there's learning involved, it's all handmade. It's all stuff that a person wrote a bunch of code, gave instructions to the computer, and the computer followed those instructions. And on the other hand, in the AI world, there's just this continual hype over the decades. So even with the invention of the perceptron in the late 50s, the New York Times reported with what the researchers said, that this is the embryo of a computer that will be able to walk, talk, see, write, reproduce itself, and be conscious of its existence. And this is described in the perceptron, which is essentially a linear classifier. In reality, as anyone with any experience in computer science knows, these things that we're calling AI are not really intelligent systems. They're all computer code, which are processing data, fitting data, and then following the instructions to produce outputs. And there's this really nice essay by Rodney Brooks about kind of like going into the details of why these misunderstandings happens. And part of it is, of course, this hype that the way these things are presented to the public present AI as if it's actually intelligent. And even the artists who work with AI software, they really view the software as an artistic tool. So one of my favorite AI artists is Helena Sarin, and she makes the analogy to watercolor, that you let the medium work with it. And so like if you've ever worked with watercolor, you feel like watercolor has a mind of its own. Like you don't just tell watercolor what to do. You have to learn to control it. You have to learn how to lay out like where the pigment's going to go, and then the fluid flows in a particular way that you can't quite predict. And working with some of these procedural algorithms feels like that as well. And when artists are working with the software, they're doing a lot. They're controlling the whole process. So even though they might procedurally generate these things, they set up network layers and set up training parameters, and then curate the results, feed in different training results, and so on. So it's a very artist-controlled process. So I actually think that, I think, and some people who discuss this feel like we should leave things open-ended. And there's certainly some artists who are very happy to convey the impression that their work, like the computer is somehow dreaming or conscious or having its own mental life. And I think there's actually some dangers to this. I have some concerns about that. I think in our society we have a lot of discussions around the role of AI software, and there's a lot of public discussion where people don't really understand that these things are really just algorithms that follow instructions. And calling our algorithms artists gives the wrong understanding to non-experts. because once you say that the computer is an artist, people then imbue it with all of these different properties that real artists have, like consciousness and emotion and understanding. And as many of us have seen, there are societal dangers to treating AI as if it's actually intelligent, because people are, systems and companies and governments are able to hide responsibility into these AI systems by saying algorithms cannot be biased or AI is objective. We're seeing proposals to make AI software be authors of patents and AI to own intellectual property. And I think these are all as a result of these dangerous discussions. And I think even the word AI is, that term has really harmed public understanding and policymaking around AI software. So all of this is an argument that our current software tools are not intelligent and not artists in any sense. They're tools controlled by artists. But there's still this future question, is there some point at which we could say that the computers themselves are artists? And it's really hard to even figure out, again, like, what does this mean?
Can a robot write a symphony? Can a robot turn a canvas into a beautiful masterpiece?
Can you?
So I want to emphasize, I think this is a prediction question. It's, will people agree that this computer is an artist? And I have opinions on this question, in which I'm going to present, but this is all, prediction and speculation. And then partly I want to make the point that it's hard to make long-term predictions about technology in general, or possibly impossible. Like if you've gone back 60 years and asked people, say in the 1960s or 50s, what will the city of the year 2001 look like? And people will say, we'll be on the moon with rocket cars and flying spaceships. If you ask people in the 1960s, what would the computer of the year 2001 look like? They'll say, it'll be small enough that you can fit it in a room of your house and it'll be able to compute 1,000 digits of pi in less than a second. So we really have a very hard time making predictions about where technologies are going in the future. Trends are a little bit easier. And even now, just again, the hype around AI is just, out of control, good and bad about what these things are going to do. But I think there are, some trends we can see about technology and how technologies are viewed and how they evolve in our understanding of them. And I want to return again to Harold Cohen to see how his thinking evolved as he developed better and better art-making algorithms.
10 years after that, I would have said, look, the program is doing this on its own. Another 10 years on, and I would have said, the fact that the program is doing this on its own is the central issue here. It was producing complex images of a high quality, and I could have had it go on forever without rewriting a single line of code. How much more autonomous than that can one get?
So at this point, he's had this experience that a lot of people have had. You write some code and it makes images that you think look really good. In his case, people are buying it and showing it in galleries. And you think, well, now I've been an artist, because that's what an artist does.
Well, of course, that's exactly the point. It's virtually impossible to imagine a human being in a similar position. The human artist is modified in the act of making art. For the program to have been similarly self-modifying would have required not merely that it be capable of assessing its own output, but that it had its own modifiable worldview to provide a basis for any meaningful assessment.
So this is this common thing that I think when people think about what it would take to have a computer that makes art is you say, oh, it just has to be able to do one thing, like make images. And then you build that thing and you say, well, it's still kind of missing something. In his case, he says, well, what if it could grow worldview? But then you keep doing that and it's still missing something else. So you say, well, artists are creative, they make works that are surprising, they have intent. But then if you actually build a system that has those properties, then you say, well, it's still missing something. And so I feel like this kind of notion of you have to have these sort of lists of properties that artists have is limiting. And the thing is, we don't even require these properties of humans. There are humans who make art that is not creative or surprising in some sense, and we still call it art. And conversely, we have algorithms that can do all of these things right now. For example, people say art requires intent and requires expression, and this idea goes back to a philosopher Colin from the 1930s. And now we don't really view these things in the contemporary art world as being what are needed for art. But I would also say it's easy to automate these things. You can, invent, have some variables in the system that are the intent, and have some system have, conditioned on these variables, produce images in some way. And it still, it still feels like a procedural system that somebody built. Some people, I've given this talk a few times when, some computer scientists raise their hand and say, well, all you have to do is look at the definition of art, and that will tell you the answer of what you need to make a computer that can create art. But the thing is that current definitions of art are attempts to describe existing practices. So they say, here are a set of activities like theater and painting and sport, theater and painting, dance, and art, and here are things that are not art. And people who define art try to define what are those things that are art. Why is theater art and sports are not art? None of these attempts to define art, explaining who can create art. We have no training data for this. We have no other entities besides humans that we consider artists right now. So these definitions of art don't even, work. And so I want to kind of return to a version of, one version of this definition is that whatever an artist does can be art. There are problems with this definition, but really the question is, what can be an artist? And this we have just no prior experience for. And so I think we have to really ask, to understand who can be an artist, we have to think about what is the reason that we have art in the first place. Why do we make art? And I'm very persuaded by the evolutionary theory of art. And there's this wonderful book by Dennis Dutton, The Art Instinct, one of my favorite books on art, that sets out this evolutionary theory and the arguments for it and what it takes to make it a plausible theory. And basically the idea is the reasons we create art from an evolutionary standpoint are for sharing and for gifts, for displays of fitness, for mating, for displays of social status and tribal affiliation, and for communication. And I observe that I think that all of these, but especially the first three, are all about our social relationships. They are all things that we do to affect our interactions or relationship with other people, how we feel about them, how they feel about us, how they see us. And so my main hypothesis is that art can only be created by agents capable of these kinds of social relationships, that purely autonomous things or purely mechanical things like computers, we don't really see them as social agents in the same way. So it's instructive to see how people have talked about animals as artists. There have been a few cases where people have proposed an animal as an artist, and part of the discussion about is like we believe that they have these social agents activities. Is really a question of whether the artists, they care about the work of as an artwork in itself, or they just care about the activity of flinging paint. We take it for granted that they could be having social relationships with their trainers. Conversely, there are natural processes that have all of the, like, say, visual elements of art that can be beautiful and transcendent and change our worldviews in different ways and inspire emotions of it in us. But we don't normally think of these things as artworks per se, because there's no human behind it. And I do really think that the authorship and process matters, like where the thing came from is significant in how we appreciate art. For example, this is an artwork that I have at home. And I think when a lot of people see it, they may not think twice about it necessarily, or they don't necessarily attend to it until I describe where it came from. This is an artist who works by a numerical optimization process that lays out blobs of paint optimized so that current image classification algorithms say with a very high probability this is a cello. So if you show this image to like Google Cloud image classification, they will say with 99% confidence this is a cello. And I think that makes the artwork much more interesting than just seeing on its own. Some other people also kind of respond to this discussion by saying, I make art for myself, and how could that be social? And I think that, you know, lots of our evolved behaviors end up being pleasurable for their own sake. So, you know, our ancestors ran for survival, for hunting and avoiding predators. And now people run for fun and exercise. Or, you know, we talk, we speak to ourselves. We speak for communication. That's the reason we are evolved for speaking. But we also talk to ourselves or sing in the shower and so on. And so based on this hypothesis, my answer to the question when a computer can be an artist is essentially when we have human level AI. We have conscious computers that we interact with. We treat them as people. We care about their personhood and our relationship with them the same way we interact with people. But this is pure science fiction. It's something that is not on our horizon. We have no idea when this is going to occur. And a world with human level AI is so different from our own world that we can't really make meaningful predictions about it. It's like, I just don't even really think it's worth talking about. On the other hand, we have social and conversational AI now, like, you know, chatbots and Eliza and Siri, Cortana, Amazon Alexa, Neko, Atsume, paratherapeutic seals. And there have been times when people have viewed these agents as alive and like had emotional relationships with them. And then they're told this is just a computer and they're like upset and they feel cheated. So it's possible that people could view these things as artists, especially if they don't understand what's going on under the hood. They don't understand what a chatbot is. But I think it's just unlikely. I just don't see how, if you know how you have any understanding about how these things work, that you could view them as artists. And the kind of software we have now, where you like git pull a repo and then you like run your network on some images and stylize it, or you write a bunch of procedural code that is AI software artwork generator. I just don't see how you could call these things artists in themselves if you really know what's going on. So it looks like there's a fair amount of time, and I see some numbers in the chat. So I'm just going to check if, no, I can't figure out how to open the chat window again. Okay, maybe I won't do this. But I guess, Pavlos, if you feel like there's anything worth discussing, feel free to interrupt now, or there's another stopping point coming soon.
You can do it then.
Okay, good. Okay, so then I'll just continue. The positive side is that new technology helps art stay vital, and we're seeing all these new technologies emerge now. And conversely, art that doesn't change grows stale. And again, on the theme that it's so hard to make predictions. It's hard to make predictions about how these technologies will drive art. So this is Les Paul, who was the main innovator, inventor of the electric solid body guitar. And he plays for like very nice jazz, show tunes, country music. There's just no way that he could have predicted how his invention would have transformed popular music over the following decades. So with that background, I want to say a little bit about what's going on in current AI-based art. There's lots of energy, lots of people who are, git pulling the latest network repos with GANs and Pix2Pix and so on, and just kicking the tires in these tools and playing around with them. Generative art, by the way, is still alive and kicking. So I follow Zach Lieberman on Instagram, and he just such creative tools, daily. And it's all basically code he wrote that are purely procedural. This other guy, Maniloide, who's also really good. He's kind of disappeared for a while, but he still has images in Behance. So just endless creativity. People just writing code and extracting images and animations from their code. Within the use of AI art, I'm going to talk about kind of two main trends and themes. And I'll just briefly touch on the first one, which is that people are using art to criticize the impacts of AI in the world, and especially equitability and fairness. And some of this art doesn't use computers at all. For example, this work, which is sort of a satire of recommendation algorithms, and the way that things like our filter bubbles affect the art experiences in the world. And also this work by an artist who created portraits of individuals where the portraits, with the constraint that these portraits could not be understood by facial recognition algorithms. On a much more critical side, one important work is the ImageNet roulette work, which explores the way that the really influential ImageNet data set, which is like hugely profoundly impactful for modern AI research. It has a lot of biases built in from the way it was constructed. And there's a really interesting discussion of the impact of that in this excavating.ai site. And perhaps even more visibly pointed was this work called White Collar, which criticizes predictive policing algorithms and recidivism prediction by predicting where white collar crime is going to occur. And this is a profile of typical suspects of white collar crime, like financial fraud and tax evasion and so on. So the other sort of big AI trend I'll spend a little bit more time on is the use of generative adversarial networks. Generative adversarial networks, if you don't know, is this tool that are designed to sample realistic images. They come from modeling the statistics of natural images. And many different artists have adopted them, experimented with them in different ways to produce these sort of unrealistic images, these evocative artworks. Here are a few more examples from other artists I really like. And they all produce these images that are sort of plausibly realistic, but not quite real, and they have this feel of modern art. This is an early experiment from one artist, and this guy shares a lot of stuff on Twitter. It's just really fun to follow and see, like, he's experimenting with the tools and playing around with them in different ways. And then this work, I'm showing here, evolved to this one, which was this installation piece that you walk up to it and makes a sort of this GAN version of your face. And this work was auctioned at, I think, Sotheby's for $50,000. And one observation I want to make about these GAN artworks is that they exhibit something called visual indeterminacy. So it's not a coincidence that GANs are so popular, and they make things that feel like modern art. Visual indeterminacy is a term coined by this artist, scientist, Robert Pepperell, to describe images that look at first like they ought to be very simple and interpretable. Like this object here, this looks like an image of an object. But as you study it further, it doesn't add up into a coherent interpretation. It doesn't, you can't tell what the silhouette is. This is obviously a simple example, but as the images get more complex, they become more visually interesting. And this became significant in the 19th century. Ambiguity is present throughout all of art, but Turner is one artist who really began to explore it. This is an image which is sunset, you can tell from the title. And it seems like there should be interpretable elements in here, but they don't resolve. But ambiguity became significant and important and valued in the modern art era. So Picasso wrote, when looking at a picture, the more associations it can open up, the better. So ambiguity and these sorts of suggestiveness became valued in modern contemporary art. And a work that is easily interpretable is not valued these days in the contemporary art world. One of my favorite painters, Gerhard Richter, has said, I don't like pictures that I understand. And this is one of his paintings, this enunciation that seems like it ought to be, there ought to be a scene there, but you can't tell what it is. And he's described, in a sense, this perceptual process. So this is a painter, and he says, we only find paintings interesting because we search for something familiar. And we usually do find these similarities, table, blanket, and so on. And when we don't find anything, we are frustrated. That keeps us excited and interested. This is a work by that painter I mentioned, Rob Pepperell. And when I first saw this, I thought GANs. And I showed this to some colleagues and asked them how they thought it was made. And a bunch of them said neural networks. And this is something he painted 15 years ago with the intention of making it indeterminate in this way, of not being resolvable. And we can see this even more if you explore this website called artbreeder.com. It lets you remix and reuse images from, combine images using, again, the general model there uses big GAN, and it's so fun. It's really cool. And you just have this endless stream of images that are evocative and intriguing, and they don't resolve into anything coherent. This feels like an object of something, but I don't know what. This one feels like some kind of eyeglasses store or shop, but you cannot resolve like where do individual objects begin or end, or what are the shapes here. And this kind of indeterminacy is something we see in these contemporary artworks that use GANs. And in fact, I think there's sort of like this sweet spot of ambiguity here. So we had early synthesis models 30 years ago in like like Heger Bergen from SIGGRAPH 95 that were quite nice, but not very general in kind of the images they would produce. We have other GANs these days, like the StyleGAN flicker faces, that every image it produces looks like a real face, and it kind of gets boring after a while. When you generate images from certain classes of big GAN, it has a really broad types of images that this particular model can generate, and often they look a little weird, and that's where the things are artistically interesting. And in fact, when models get too good, artists break them. Like, so the image on the right here uses StyleGAN flicker faces or StyleGAN with faces. And the artist has deliberately, deleted layers or moved layers around and messed things up in order to create these more weird, evocative images deliberately. And Artbreeder, in fact, also is not using Big GAN the way it was meant to be used because it's using invalid class embedding vectors. So I have a lot of topics I'm covering here in this talk, but my main conclusion and summary is that these new technologies are tools that benefit art and artists, and we're seeing that with these AI and GAN tools I mentioned. People are exploring them and really creating interesting new types of works today. I believe that art is fundamentally a social activity, even though we may do it to develop our own skills or to meditation or whatever. It's really something that's evolved to affect our social relationships. And so as a result, I just don't see how software could be considered artists anytime in the foreseeable future. It requires human level AI, which is not something on the horizon. And again, amazing new art is coming. We're seeing it these days. And it's just super exciting to follow the developments in the field and how artists are going to use these new things to influence our culture and change the way that we see the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. Great talk. There are a few questions on the chat. A couple of comments. I don't want you want to read them, but Kathleen has a comment and a question. And then there is Leonardo from San Diego who published something he wants to come. Do you want to read them? And
sure. So I have the, I don't know if it comes to the screen share, but I have the Zoom chat open. So I guess I have to, when I see an oil painting, I would imagine.
You want to stop sharing? It's going
yeah. Sure. Yeah, so I think this is a really good point. So I think, so what she's describing is that when you see, say, a painting, you have some mental model or mental conception of what was involved in the process of that. Like, so even if you don't paint regularly, you can imagine, everyone is drawn and like you imagine what's at least involved in the physical process. And I think it's a big problem for people's appreciation of AI art is that it's, artists are disincentivized to talk about their process per se and to like romanticize it. And a lot of people, there's like a lot of the presentation of AI based art is very gimmicky. It's like, what if the computer could dream and stuff? And so as a result, when you don't have a sense of like the sort of coding process and writing code to produce these things, you don't necessarily appreciate what was involved in that. And I feel like a lot of works that if I had just seen, if someone told me someone painted it, I would care about it a lot less than knowing where it came from. This is an issue artists will have. So I agree with that. I don't know if there's follow-up questions, but I guess I'll just move to the next question in the chat about, so the question is, computers producing art have been presenting as individuals. Humans doing art are usually influenced by their peers. Yeah, so I think, all of our activities are influenced by people around us, and we sort of arbitrarily view. We have also this myth of like the individual genius when great artists or philosophers or scientists are can't work in a vacuum. People draw influence from their peers. We sort of draw this arbitrary distinction. And there's also a notion of collaboration that filmmaking is a collaboration. Lots of different people are involved, but we still kind of view the film director as kind of the author, but we can still recognize that other people, actors and cinematographers also played important roles. Yeah, and I think we just draw this line, this person is the artist and the author, and we'll do the same thing when computers are making art. Have there been attempts to use sound as an input to computer algorithms to output visual representations? There definitely have. I don't know much about this stuff. I would think of like Ryoji Ikeda as one artist who I think has used sound as input. Or I'm not sure if it's data as input or more generic data or sound. Yeah, I think the answer is yes, but I don't know examples myself off the top of my head. So the next person says art is what people consider art. I suspect a lot of people, what is considered art today would be considered garbage a few hundred years ago. I think that's definitely true. Our notion of art evolves over time, but it is the result of a cultural consensus. It's not like you can't just, it's not like we can say anything is art and then it's art. It's the questions are, what are things that people would agree are art? Just like any other thing, you could say, many other activities are the result of cultural consensus. What is a theorem is also arguably a result of a cultural consensus. But there are still things that we would not ever, these communities would not agree on. I see the next one, it doesn't seem like there's a question per se, pointer to an article you can check out in the chat. The request for a copy of the slides. I'm not sure I'm ready to share the slides, but I can definitely put links in the chat here. Let me, I can discuss that with you. Sorry?
The talk is recorded, so people can go back to the talk if they want.
Okay, so maybe it's the best thing. Or if you while in the chat here, if you have questions, I can also share links as well. Or I guess you can watch the recording. I see a few more questions. Let's see. So every year there's state-of-the-art research developments. Yeah, so the question is about research and academia reaching industry in general. And there's always substantial lag between research community and industry. And I would say, research, in academic research, we explore many different things and tried out many different ideas, not knowing which ones are actually going to be useful. And some tiny fraction of that ends up being useful and adopted by industry through a combination of a whole bunch of unpredictable factors. So a tiny fraction of research gets adopted, but we can't predict in advance which research things will be useful. And I can give one example in the computer animation industry. Like we do lots of research in computer graphics with the intention these things will be used by the computer animation industry or by novices making animation. And yet when you go in the computer animation industry, they are very locked into specific workflows and they will not be interested in 99% of what research does. And so instead, some of that research will only gets useful if there's a startup or a disruptor using that technology. And who knows what things people will start new technologies around or new companies. There's a quote that seems nice. And finally, there's a comment. I think if we can consider a real AI an artist, if it can create a book using human languages, and people were, but I think we can do this now. This is the sort of comment that I disagree with, because GPT-3, the natural language software from OpenAI, it can make very long, plausible pieces of text, especially if you're working in domains where expressivity is more valued than logic. Like Mario Klingemann has generated great artist statements using GPT-3, and people are using it for lots of other stuff. So that's why I think we have these tools now that can do these things that satisfy class, sort of shallow definitions of art. So I don't buy that argument. So I've just sped through a bunch of these questions in the chat. If there's any follow-up comments or questions, I'm happy to discuss or have a more open-ended discussion. And thanks again for all the comments and questions.
All right, let's thanks Aaron again. Thank you, everybody. I'll be answering some questions about the recording. And thank you again.
Thank you.
Good to see you, Aaron. Hope to see you in person sometime soon.
Yeah, likewise. Good to see you. Yeah, thanks. I guess that's it.
All right, great talk. Thank you.
All right, bye.
Do these kinds of philosophical questions come up a lot at Adobe, or is this something that you're more interested in, like on the side, or like, does this get discussed a lot at work, I guess?
I don't think so. I mean, you know, from the core point of view, like people are just interested in doing research, publishing papers, and shipping software. And I think, like my background, it's very much in a lot of this work. It's like, you know, people in the computer graphics world and computer graphics research. There's this really strong ethos that software is tools, partly because of this, you know, experience with the computer animation industry and computer graphics in general. For me, this is just stuff I'm interested in philosophically, and partly seeing all of the hype around AI art made me want to, you know, think about this and, you know, discuss it more.
Gotcha. But like the bulk of what people are working on right now at Adobe is more focused on like graphics rendering or like modeling, I guess. I'm just interested in like kind of broadly what the research community within Adobe is working on right now.
I think, well, there's lots of different things. People in Adobe Research are doing lots of just basic computer vision, recognition, tracking, flow, image synthesis with GANs and image control, geometric modeling, character animation. There's also other parts of research that I'm not as exposed to, or they're doing more like machine learning analytics stuff. This is a pretty broad set of interests.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you.
All right, Aaron, thank you again. Sorry you couldn't meet in person. That was the idea, so we can see Hans Peter and the rest of us. But maybe next time.
Yep. All right.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone.